Welcome to ND Love Story, where love stories are told with raw emotions and captivating storytelling. If you enjoy heartfelt and mesmerizing love stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to ND Love Story so you won't miss any episode. Los Angeles, a city that never sleeps, is a place where brightly lit streets conceal countless secrets. In a secluded corner of the city's police department building, Lucas Mitchell sat in front of a computer screen, the faint blue light reflecting on his pensive face. At 32, he was one of the department's best cybercrime detectives. Complex code and data strings were the only things that put him at ease. More so than any conversation with his colleagues, Lucas wasn't the type to seek attention. He was quiet, meticulous, and reserved, a necessity after what happened in San Francisco. Just 6 months prior, he'd been a rising star in the field of cybersecurity investigation. But an internal scandal had caused everything to crumble. Baseless rumors about his personal life spread through his old precinct, turning every glance from a colleague into a scrutinizing stare. Eventually, Lucas chose to leave, starting over in LA. Here, he focused solely on his work, avoiding all personal contact, a principle he hadn't broken. But then, Damian Carter arrived, at 41, with a military background. This man brought not only the toughness of a leader but also an elusive enigma. With his calm and astute demeanor, Carter quickly caught the attention of the entire LA Police Department. And for Lucas, the arrival of the new captain wasn't just a change in the system, it was the beginning of something more dangerous. Something deeper. Monday morning, the atmosphere at the Los Angeles Police Department was particularly bustling. News of the new captain, Damian Carter, had spread throughout the departments all week. They said he was a former military man who'd commanded many special operations before transitioning to law enforcement. Cold, disciplined, and somewhat intimidating. That's what people whispered when discussing their new boss. But Lucas Mitchell didn't pay much attention. He'd never been interested in internal politics or powerful figures. For him, the job was always the top priority. At precisely 9 a.m., the conference room door swung open. Damian Carter entered, a tall man, athletic build, with sharp eyes that quickly scanned the room. The atmosphere immediately subdued, conversations fading. Without a word, everyone was captivated by his imposing presence. Lucas, who usually avoided such things, couldn't help but look up. His eyes met Damian's, a brief moment, but enough for Lucas to sense something indescribable. A chill ran down his spine. Not exactly fear, but tension, and a strange feeling he didn't dare name. Immediately after the meeting, before Lucas could return to his desk, a deep voice echoed from behind. "Mitchell, in my office." Lucas startled, turning to face Damian. The captain's gaze was sharp but not threatening. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as Lucas followed Damian into the office. When the door closed, the air between the two men suddenly thickened. "I've reviewed your recent case files. Impressive, to say the least," Damian began, his voice deep and warm but carrying an authoritative force that Lucas couldn't ignore. Lucas frowned, trying to remain calm. "Just doing my job." Damian's lips curled slightly, as if amused by Lucas's response. "Don't be so modest. I read the reports from San Francisco too. You have talent, but you choose to hide it. Why is that?" Lucas tensed slightly. Mentioning San Francisco was mentioning what he'd been trying to leave behind. But Damian didn't press further, only silently observing him. The conversation ended with a nod of approval from Damian. But Lucas had the feeling this wasn't the last time he'd face that penetrating gaze. In the days that followed, Lucas began to notice something strange. Damian didn't act particularly friendly. But whenever they were near each other, the atmosphere seemed different. It wasn't exactly tension, but something unclear, an invisible pull that both men deliberately ignored. Once, while reviewing data on the screen, Damian stood closer than usual. The faint scent of his cologne and the warmth of his body disoriented Lucas. When Damian leaned down to point to a line of code on the screen, his hand accidentally brushed against Lucas's S. A fleeting touch, but enough to make Lucas jump. Another time, as Lucas walked down to the parking lot, it started to rain. He hurried, but slipped because the ground was wet. Damian's strong hand immediately grabbed his arm, steadying him. "Careful, Mitchell," Damian said, his voice holding a hint of reproach but also something else, an unspoken concern. Lucas froze. Was it coincidence? Or something more? Lucas had always kept to himself at work. He wasn't good at social relationships and didn't like being the center of attention. Yet, since Damian Carter's arrival, everything seemed to have changed in a way he couldn't control. At first, they were just small moments. Fleeting gestures that Lucas told himself were accidental. One early morning, when he arrived at the office as usual, he found a cup of coffee on his desk. Black, light on sugar. Exactly how he took it every day. He frowned, looked around, and met the eyes of Damian, who was standing nearby with a stack of files in his hands. "Thanks, but I don't remember asking anyone to get me coffee," Lucas said, trying to sound casual. Damian just shrugged. "You always come in early and don't have time to leave your desk. I figured you needed it." Lucas was confused, but didn't say anything more. He picked up the coffee, feeling the warmth in his hand. A strange feeling arose in his chest, a warmth mixed with an unnamed fear. Their conversations gradually became more personal as well. One time, during the team's lunch break, Lucas was reading a book when Damian came to sit across from him. Glancing at the cover, Arthur Conan Doyle. "Huh? I always found his character a little too perfect," Damian remarked. Lucas looked up, raising an eyebrow. "Sherlock Holmes isn't perfect. He has his dark sides, psychological issues, and arrogance, but it's those things that make him real. I still prefer Raymond Chandler. Philip Marlowe has more depth, more realism, and more importantly, he writes great dialogue." Lucas smiled slightly. "Oh, so you like the tough, gritty detective type?" Damian tilted his head, his eyes flashing with something unreadable. "I like things that are real. Logical deduction doesn't always solve the problem. Sometimes, it's intuition that leads us to the truth." The debate lasted longer than Lucas thought. The professional boundaries between them seemed to blur, revealing a different connection, something deeper, more complex. Then, there were moments when the distance between them became dangerously thin. One late night, Lucas was still hunched over his computer screen, analyzing data for a complex case. Damian stood beside him, watching intently. "This line of code, it looks like a trace of a hidden transaction," Damian said, leaning down, his finger gliding lightly across the keyboard. Lucas turned, but at that moment, his hand accidentally touched Damian's. The warmth from his skin transferred to Damian, and for a second, neither of them pulled away. Lucas could clearly hear his heart pounding in his chest, faster and harder than usual. Finally, he was the one to break eye contact, pretending to refocus on the screen. But that feeling remained, a lingering sensation clinging to him even after Damian had left. Lucas began to feel disoriented. What was this? Admiration? A power play? Or something he didn't dare admit? He deliberately avoided Damian, but couldn't control the times their eyes accidentally met in meetings. Damian's glances became sharper, and Lucas couldn't deny that they held something different. Their colleagues weren't oblivious either. One afternoon, when Lucas was getting coffee, Emma from accounting stood next to him, crossing her arms, a knowing smile on her face. "Captain Carter has been paying a lot of attention to you lately," she said, raising her eyebrows. Lucas startled, nearly spilling his coffee. "I don't know what you're talking about." Emma chuckled softly. "Come on. You think people haven't noticed? Every time you speak, he pays attention. Every time you walk into the room, his eyes follow you. It's not just a boss's concern." Lucas didn't answer. He just quickly turned away. But Emma's words echoed in his head all evening. What confused him the most was, she was right. And he knew it himself. But what he didn't dare face was, did Damian realize it? And if so, what would he do? That evening, the Los Angeles Police Department held a formal ceremony to honor individuals for their outstanding contributions during the year. Amidst the applause and congratulations, Lucas and Damian walked onto the stage together to receive awards for their success in breaking up a large-scale financial fraud case. Lucas stood beside Damian, the spotlights shining down on them, the eyes of those around them filled with admiration. When Damian spoke, he didn't talk much about the victory or the figures, but instead mentioned Lucas's perseverance and talent in such a personal way that Lucas had to look at him, his heart beating strangely. After the ceremony, as people began to disperse, Lucas went to leave, but Damian stopped him with a light touch on the elbow. "Drink with me?" His voice was deep but did not sound like a request that could be refused. Lucas hesitated, But then he nodded. They found a quiet bar in the hotel, where the dim lighting created a space far more intimate than the police department's conference room. Damien sat across from Lucas, slowly stirring his whiskey, while Lucas swirled the drink in his hand, trying to find something to focus on besides Damien's sharp eyes. "I've never seen you so relaxed, Mitchell," Damien said, a slight curl at the corner of his lips. Lucas smiled lightly, shaking his head. "I think this is the first time we've talked without a report or case file on the table." Damien was silent for a moment, then spoke, his voice deep and sure. "There are things we can't ignore forever, Lucas." Lucas suddenly felt the atmosphere become too heavy. "What do you mean?" Damien tilted his head, his eyes not leaving Lucas. "I think you know very well what I'm talking about." Lucas swallowed hard. His throat was dry, and not from the alcohol. "We shouldn't be talking about this." Damien raised an eyebrow. "Why not?" "Because it's not right." Lucas tightened his grip on the glass, his eyes looking down at the table. "We're colleagues. You're my superior. If someone found out, I don't care." Damien cut him off, his voice deeper, full of conviction. "It's not about position or reputation. It's about us continuing to pretend that this doesn't exist." Lucas felt like someone had just sucked all the air out of the room. His heart beat faster, not from fear, but from realizing that Damien had said what he didn't dare admit. A long silence stretched between them. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Damien slowly leaned closer, his eyes still locked on Lucas. "Tell me you don't feel anything, and I'll never mention this again." Lucas wanted to speak, wanted to deny it, but the words were stuck in his throat, and he couldn't utter a lie. The air between them crackled. Then Damien slowly removed his hand from the drink, placing it on Lucas's wrist. The touch was gentle, but like a spark igniting all the pent-up emotions. Lucas took a deep breath, as if preparing for a decision he couldn't take back. "We can't do this here." Damien looked at him for a second, then nodded. "Then let's go to my room." They left the bar without a word. Everything happened quickly, but not hastily. The elevator doors closed, leaving just the two of them in the confined space. Lucas could feel Damien's hot breath right beside him. He didn't turn, but he could feel Damien's eyes fixed on him. When the door of the 15th floor suite closed, all the barriers Lucas had tried to erect collapsed. Damien didn't wait. He reached out and gently touched Lucas's jaw, forcing him to look straight into his sharp eyes. "We have nothing to hide from anymore." His voice was hoarse, full of restraint. Lucas swallowed, and finally, he did what he'd wanted to do for so long. He let go of everything. He pulled Damien into a kiss, powerful and full of the desire that had been pent up for months. Damien responded with all his intensity, his hands gripping Lucas's waist, pulling him even closer. They kissed as if time no longer existed, as if all the laws and rules no longer mattered. And that night, they broke every boundary. After that night, nothing was the same. Lucas tried to act like everything was normal. He came to the office on time, handled case files, and attended meetings as usual. But there was one thing he couldn't control: Damien. Damien's eyes were different when he looked at him. It was no longer just the gaze of a boss towards a subordinate, but the gaze of a man who had touched the deepest corners of longing. Lucas could feel it every time they passed each other in the hallway. Every time Damien lingered too long by his desk during meetings. Everything between them was no longer just an unspoken attraction, but had become an undeniable truth. That terrified Lucas. He started to avoid Damien. At group meetings, he kept his distance. When Damien came near, he quickly found a way to leave. He refused private conversations, trying to rebuild the wall he had lost that night. But instead of returning everything to normal, it only made the atmosphere between them so tense it was suffocating. And Lucas wasn't the only one who noticed it. In the police department, rumors spread faster than any case. First, there were the curious looks from colleagues, eyes lingering on them for too long, whispers behind their backs. No one said it outright, but Lucas could feel the suspicion in the air. One day, Emma from accounting approached him again, leaning against his desk with a knowing smile. "You and Captain Carter have gotten pretty close lately, haven't you?" Her voice seemed playful, but Lucas knew it was full of hidden meaning. He tried to keep his composure. "He's my boss. Of course, we work together." Emma shrugged. "Yeah, but I've never seen him pay so much attention to anyone. Don't you find that strange?" Lucas just remained silent, feeling a surge of unease in his chest. But that was nothing compared to what happened the next morning. An anonymous email was sent to the entire police department. The subject line was simple, but chilling. Inappropriate relationship between Captain Carter and a subordinate? Lucas felt the blood in his body freeze when he opened the email. There was no clear evidence, but the words were full of innuendo. It talked about the times Carter favored Lucas in cases, the long conversations after work, the glances that everyone had noticed but no one dared to speak out about. Lucas closed the email, his heart pounding, his hand tightened on the mouse, trying to keep calm, but he knew this was no longer a personal matter. It had become a ticking time bomb. That evening, as Lucas was packing up to leave the office, Damien appeared. "We need to talk." His voice was deep but sharp, carrying a force that Lucas couldn't refuse. Damien led him into the office, closing the door behind them. He walked to the desk, propping his hands on the surface, his eyes fixed on Lucas. "I got an offer." Lucas frowned. "What offer?" "A position in Washington." Damien paused for a moment. "Director of the cybersecurity unit. A big opportunity. A fresh start." Lucas felt a cold draft run down his spine. "So, you're going?" Damien stared at him, his eyes so deep they seemed to want to penetrate every thought in Lucas's head. "Not if you don't come with me." The room became eerily silent. Lucas looked at Damien, trying to understand how serious he was. And when he saw the certainty in those eyes, a storm arose within him. What would going with Damien mean? It meant leaving everything he had built in Los Angeles. It meant stepping into a new life, not knowing what awaited him. It meant giving up safety to step onto a path he had never dared to imagine. But if he stayed, Lucas would have to continue pretending that nothing had happened. Continue enduring the scrutinizing stares, the rumors, and the growing distance between him and Damien. Continue living a life he wasn't sure he could endure any longer. Damien stepped closer, his voice lower, warmer, but full of weight. "I know this isn't an easy decision, Lucas, but I don't want to keep hiding anymore. I don't want to keep up this false distance. I want you, but not in this secretive way." Lucas felt his breath catch. He wanted to say something, but couldn't. Damien reached out, gently touching Lucas's face. The touch was light but meaningful, like a silent question. "Come with me." Lucas closed his eyes for a moment. Taking a deep breath, he had to make a choice. And this time, he knew he couldn't run away. The rain that night fell ceaselessly, each drop breaking on the car window as Lucas drove through the empty streets of Los Angeles. Inside him, another storm was raging, a tug of war between reason and emotion. Between what was safe and what he truly wanted. When he stopped in front of Damien's apartment, his heart was pounding harder than ever. He had been thinking about this for days, wondering if he was making a mistake. But then, every time he remembered Damien's eyes, to that statement, "Come with me," which was full of sincerity, he knew he could not continue to pretend. Lucas knocked on the door, and just seconds later, Damien appeared. He was still wearing the simple shirt, hand-holding unfinished glass of wine. But when he saw Lucas, his eyes changed, no more the calmness of a police chief, but expectation, hope, which was something deep that Lucas has never seen before. "You came," Damien said, his voice soft but a certain weight. Lucas swallowed, stood in front of the door for a second, and then walked in. Damien's familiar smell, smelled with wood and whiskey, engulfed him as the door closed. He turned to look at Damien, his eyes filled with mixed emotions. "I'm too tired of hiding," Lucas said, his voice a little shaky but decisive. "I don't want to continue living in fear, under the judgmental eyes of others. I don't want to have to avoid every time I look at you. I want to live true to myself." Damien looked at him, his deep blue eyes lit. Lucas can't give it a name. And then, after a moment of silence, he said, lightly curled his lips, voice warm but decisive, "Then go with me." Lucas took a deep breath. He knew that he could not go back anymore. Less than 2 weeks later, their decision became a reality. Damien resigned from his position as chief of the Los Angeles Police Department, taking the job as director of the cybersecurity unit in Washington. Lucas, after many nights of thinking, also sent a job transfer request. He thought there would be judgmental eyes, whispering gossips, but what surprised him was the reaction of colleagues. One day before they left, Emma from accounting stepped up to Lucas's desk with a cup of coffee. "Are you really going?" she asked, her voice mixed with regret. Lucas nodded, feeling a little worried. Yeah. Emma looked at him for a moment, and then suddenly laughed. You know, I bet everyone guessed this a long time ago. Lucas frowned. What? She winked. Did you think the entire police department didn't notice the way Captain Carter looked at you? We were just waiting to see when you two would admit it. Lucas stopped. A confused and relieving spread all over his body. Turns out his fear just did he impose. The last night in Los Angeles, Lucas and Damien stood on the balcony of Damien's apartment, looking down at the city that had witnessed all that happened between them. The distant lights flickered, like thousands of eyes watching them close an old chapter to open a new beginning. Lucas turned to Damien, smiling slightly. Are we really doing this? Damien put a hand on Lucas's back, pulling him closer. That's right, and I've never been sure of anything more than that. They stood there, together, as Los Angeles gradually faded into memory. Tomorrow, they would start over in Washington. No more barriers. No more fear. There are just them, and what they had chosen for themselves. Washington, a new city, a new beginning. Lucas stood by the window of their small apartment, looking out at the sparkling waters of the Potomac River in the fading sunset light. The wind blew, bringing the cold air of autumn, but for the first time in a long time, he did not feel alone. Just a few months ago, the thought of leaving Los Angeles, giving up everything familiar to follow something uncertain, still confused him, but now, standing in this peaceful space, with Damien right beside him, he knew he had made the right decision. Their apartment was small but cozy, with large windows overlooking the lake. Each morning, they woke up together, no longer fearing scrutinizing eyes or rumors behind their backs. They could go to work together without trying to hide the glances they gave each other. No more of those false distances. Damien was still Lucas's boss. But now, they weren't just colleagues, they were a real couple, with no need to hide anymore. The first morning in the new apartment, Lucas woke up to the smell of coffee in the air. He walked out of the bedroom, seeing Damien standing by the stove, stirring his coffee with a slight smile when he saw him. Good morning, Damien said, his voice deep and warm, as if every new day of theirs would always begin this way. Lucas leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest. Good morning. It's strange. What's strange? Not having to hide, not having to think about whether anyone's watching or not. Just simply living. Damien put his coffee down, walked over, and wrapped his arms around Lucas's waist, pulling him close. It should have always been like this. Lucas chuckled softly, resting his forehead on Damien's shoulder. Yeah, but now we have it. And I wouldn't trade this for anything. Was everything really that easy? Not really. They still faced challenges, still had to find ways to adapt to their new jobs, new colleagues, but the difference was that they no longer had to live in fear. Lucas realized that love was not something that needed to be hidden. He had spent too many years covering up his emotions, running from himself, fearing what others would think. But in the end, the most important thing wasn't how the world saw them. It was whether they dared to grasp their own happiness or not. One evening, when they were both standing on the balcony, looking down at the glittering lights reflecting on the water, Lucas softly said, "We shouldn't let prejudice decide our happiness." Damien didn't respond right away. He just quietly tightened his grip on Lucas's hand in his, as an affirmation that they had chosen the right path. Dawn rose, the first sunlight streaming through the window, painting a warm picture of a new day. Damien leaned in, whispering in Lucas's ear, his voice unusually gentle and subdued. Finally, we get to be ourselves. Lucas smiled, closing his eyes, letting himself sink into that moment. They had gone through difficulties, fears, confusion, but now, they had arrived where they belonged, beside each other, with no more hiding, and that was what mattered most.